I grew up on fantasy. It's always been a very special genre to me, but as I've grown older, my tastes have matured a little. I know what you're thinking right now. That's a very pretentious thing to say, but stay with me, stay with me. Mostly in the realm of characterization, because when I've branched out in other genres, entire new worlds opened up for me, especially how deep character work can go. And so when I return to fantasy, more often than not, I find the characterization very shallow. And you may be saying, that's not the main reason people read fantasy, and you might be right, but I would argue that George R. R. Martin would not have the success he does if that weren't the case, because his series, A Song of Ice and Fire, is probably one of the very, very few fantasy series that created characters that feel real, they feel grounded. They don't just feel like they exist on the page in the plot that they're a part of in the book, but they exist off the page. They have lives outside of the main story until now. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? Let's talk about what this book is, The Darkness That Comes Before, by R. Scott Bakker. A holy war is brewing in the world of Yarva, a land scarred by an apocalyptic past. Factions stir and take their stances while a mysterious traveler emerges at the center of it all, with a motive of his own, crossing the paths of others entangled in the oncoming conflict. So what did I think? Well, as with many fantasy novels I talk about on this channel, I think it's important to discuss the setting because it is very crucial and very special in this book. As you'll know, many fantasy novels take place in a pseudo-European generic setting, and that's totally fine. I like that stuff. But this one was doing something quite different. It was almost merging all of these different cultures together to create its own amalgam of something unique. I was swept away when the characters were kind of just plodding along through these ancient structures and these massive halls, and it just felt different to me. And I was really in love. It was reminiscent to me of whenever I played Dark Souls or the Dark Souls games. Just that kind of sense of awe you get when you're walking out there alone in this crazy, creepy world with unknown possibilities lays before you. In the beginning. So one thing I should mention is that I have been informed that R. Scott Bakker, when he was writing this book and this series in general, he had two books by his side. One of those was the Bible. The other one was Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. I can't really see many similarities with Blood Meridian in this, but there are many similarities with the Bible. And this is kind of where things fell apart a little bit for me, setting-wise. Everybody out there is familiar with the Bible, right? So in this book, we have an apocalypse. We have a holy war. We have crucifixion. We have almost a Jesus-like figure. Hell, we even have a baby that is born to a woman without having coupled, right? I know this is a delusion in the story, but again, thematically it's there. So little too on the nose for me, and definitely when you get into the book a little bit further, it is very Middle Eastern inspired. And that's totally fine. It's just I was hoping that it would continue this strange, mysterious mix of cultures. It kind of does, it kind of doesn't. Again, a little bit too on the nose for me, but at the very least, I can say it's different than most settings you have read in a fantasy novel. Let's talk about character next, and I think I'm going to order this in my favorite characters to my least favorite characters. So as we count down, you're going to be maybe a little bit surprised. I don't know, we'll see. So first and foremost, my favorite characters. And these are going to be kind of in pairs or groups because you'll notice that Bakker constructed these characters in sets, even in a trio at some point. But anyway, let's start it off with my favorite characters of this entire novel. And that would be Esmenet and Achamian. So we have a prostitute and we have a sorcerer. So why are these my two favorite characters? Well, they are unexpected. Normally, a protagonist or the main characters or main players in a book, they're not, you don't hear about many prostitutes and maybe sorcerers, okay, maybe sorcerers. But what makes them great is that they felt like they had a life before I met them in this story. They felt like they were dealing with stuff off the page that had nothing to do with the main plot. And I think that is the main shortcoming in many fantasy novels, is it doesn't feel like these characters exist off the page. They don't have the same desires and fears that real people do. It's all about the plot. And that's what I love most about these two characters, is that they exist off the page, or they felt like they did anyway to me. So they're middle-aged, and Esmenet isn't just the hooker with a heart of gold. No, she's not that cliche. She has pride in her work, and that's one thing I will commend Bakker on, is that he didn't lean into cliche with a prostitute character. She's proud of what she does, or at least she thinks she is anyway. And she's lost a daughter, so she has trauma there. And her and Achamian was one of her customers, and then they just kind of hit it off, and they keep kind of coming back and forth over time. And the best thing is you can tell there's this familial kind of bond with them. not only as husband and wife, but I came in, he was mentoring a young sorcerer at one point who kind of strayed from the path, and he viewed him as a son. And so you can see they were trying to create this family, but inherently there's conflict, right? Because Esmond has to make a living as a prostitute, so she has to take other clients, which, you know, leads to jealousy, of course. And Akamian is a sorcerer that is kind of hurled about like a puppet, as he is required to do different things, go to different places by his order. And I think because Bakker created these characters around the concept of familiarity, right? We all know what it's like to yearn for somebody, maybe to want something that we cannot have, maybe feel like time has passed us by and all of those things are impossible to achieve any longer, which is definitely the case with these two characters because they're about middle-aged. And I will add, these are probably the most well-realized, most realistic, most grounded characters I've ever read in a fantasy novel, so hats off to Bakker on this one. My only complaint is they kind of faltered toward the end. They had such a great start and then they kind of petered out in the plot. But again, I've also been told that this book was not meant to be a single volume, meaning it's kind of a setup novel, which I'll get to more about when I talk about the plot. All right, next up is Emperor Xarius and his nephew Comphis. The great thing about these two though, oh yeah, Comphis, he's kind of out there, I don't know, he's heir to something. He's out there leading battles. He's kind of a badass warlord. But what makes these characters great is Xarius' mother, because now this is what I'm talking about. We have this trio here. So Xarius' mother did some very questionable, very terrible things to Xarius, which is kind of, you can see where he's coming from. You can see why he's psychologically injured, let's say. And he hates his mother, even though he loves his mother. His mind and his psyche has been absolutely twisted by her. So I love what Bakker did with the character in that regard. And to make matters worse, his mother absolutely loves his nephew. And so that is more salt in the wound. So any scenes with these characters was more or less my second favorite. All right, next up is Near. He's a chieftain of the Utimat. This is a very Conan the Barbarian kind of character. I actually think more Khal Drogo from Game of Thrones. That's very applicable, I think, in that regard. He's a big badass dude. He's got scars on his arms that represent everybody he's killed, but he's bisexual or gay. I think that's his that's the little twist that Bakker gives us, but it doesn't really manifest in the story. It doesn't really feel like he's fighting against it. It doesn't feel like it's bringing up conflict, not just inner conflict, but with other characters. At least I didn't spot it. But again, I think maybe this stuff kind of develops in other novels. However, I never found him interesting. At the very beginning, when he's in this battle and he's sneaking around, just the voice of the character, I was really looking forward to getting to know him better because I'm a Barbarian fan. What can I say? I'm a massive Conan the Barbarian fan, so I was hoping he would kind of fit that for me. But alas, he really didn't. He kind of ended up being a pretty boring character, a pretty stale character, pretty one-note character. But again, maybe he develops in other novels. The last character I'm going to talk about is my least favorite, and that is Kellis, who is arguably kind of the mysterious traveler that is holding this entire thing together. I like to call him Mary Sue the monk because that's exactly what he is. He comes out of this this ancient sect or cult. He's out seeking his father. He's trying to find his father. The one interesting thing I can say about him, though, is that with Nair, right, again, a lot of the characters, a lot of the great character work in this book comes from the dynamics. It's the relationships. It's not the characters in isolation, but again, how they relate to one another. I forgot to mention, Nair, he wants to kill Kellis' father. Kellis also wants to find his father for, you know, basically the same reason. And so it's great because when they meet up, you inherently feel like there's going to be a conflict, there's going to be a battle, and there kind of is, but then they find common ground, and it's kind of a subversion of what you would expect in that regard. But Kellis, oh Kellis, he's the most boring, philosophy-spewing, lifeless skin sack to enter this book, at least right now, right? At least right now. And I should speak about the philosophy a little bit. It's kind of funny because I knew going into it there was going to be some philosophical underpinnings to this book, and there definitely is. And I remember early on, there's something that really caught me. And I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of a cool thing to think about. But then later in the book, when he's spouting off philosophical ideas to these supporting characters, it's very basic stuff. I'm not a philosopher by any stretch, but I guess I was hoping for something more profound, something that would give me pause, make me think, but I never got that. The one cool thing, though, is from the title, The Darkness That Comes Before, it's more of a deterministic philosophy, so it's kind of stemming from sort of a string of causality, and it appears as if the Dunye and the group of people he is part of, they're trying to harness that power to therefore have free will. I'm not quite sure yet. I've only read one book. But yeah, Kellis, Mr. Mary Sue, he kind of walks around like he's, you know, a god among men, which again, the kind of Jesus complex. He kicks a lot of ass. He never gets hurt. We're in Mary Sueville. But again, I can only imagine because he feels to be the center of this entire book that he develops in other novels. All right, let's talk about the plot next. And unfortunately, this is probably one of the most disjointed parts of the entire novel, because this novel is not really a novel. It's a setup novel, if you want to call it that. There's not a complete arc. I felt like when I got to the end of this book, there should have been more. It felt like the ending was tacked on because, again, we live in the world of publishing. We cannot publish a 2,000-page novel. Well, I guess we could. But I've been told that Bakker never intended it to be a trilogy. He intended it to be all one book, but guess what, Bakker? We live in the world of publishing where that's not how things work, so I'm not going to cut you any slack on this one. If you guys have been around this channel any length of time, you'll know that every goddamn book needs to have a complete arc, in my opinion. Something that has been set in motion at the beginning hasn't been completed in some regard, and that's exactly what happens here. Basically, the plot is Kellis pops out. He starts wandering the lands in search of his father, of course. He starts crossing paths with all of these characters. Again, they each have their own stories, which are all great. That's what I love about this book. And I also love that the construction of the chapters, because I'm so glad at least Bakker knew how to write a chapter. So another problem I see often in fantasy novels, or any novels in general, is that, like, authors, for whatever reason, don't know how to write chapters. There's a structure to a chapter. It needs to feel like something ends, or needs to feel like there's a shift, an emotional shift in the character, some kind of change, not just a plot moving forward, but something emotional at its core, something that we can invest ourselves in. Bakker knows how to do this. I will commend him on that. I always felt that every chapter in this was exciting for the most part. Yes, there's some exposition here, but it wasn't too excessive. But anyway, yeah, the plot, it's pretty much all these people kind of gathering together in the same spot, and then it ends. We end with a drone shot of all of these things, all of these factions kind of stirring and forming alliances and politicking, etc., etc. Speaking of politicking, there's a lot of that in this book too, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think as long as I'm invested in the character who all of this stuff is going to affect, I can get into it. And there's some of that here, but there's a lot of it that's not. So I found myself kind of drifting a little bit. But yeah, great chapters, great explorations of character, but this is not a novel. There is no arc here. There is no end in sight. This is purely a setup novel, which, as you know, as I mentioned 1,000 times, I can't stand. All right, let's talk about the writing next, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This novel is, I would say, very well written for a fantasy novel, for any novel in that regard. The one thing that I always look for is voice with POV in characters. So a lot of authors don't understand that not only is it the way someone speaks in dialogue, it's the way they observe the world. That needs to be written in their own voice. And I definitely noticed that here. So when you go to Nair, the battle-hardened barbarian, the narration is different. The observations are different, not just the dialogue. Same thing when you go to Acamian, same thing when you go to Esmenet. So I will definitely commend Bakker in that regard. As I mentioned earlier, there is also exposition here, but it's not excessive, so it didn't really bother me too much. Yes, there were some chapters where I was kind of drifting, as I like to call it, but all in all, not too bad. So yes, great writing overall. You can tell that Bakker really took the time to not just capture the voices of the characters with every POV shift, but create a living, breathing world that is extremely atmospheric, which is why I'm going to give The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker a 7.5 out of 10. A fantasy novel that really isn't a novel, with a fresh take on setting in the fantasy genre until it's not, with some of the best characterization I've ever read in a fantasy novel until it's not, with a plot that is really nothing more than assembling a bunch of characters and setting the stage for what is to come. But that said, overall, I really enjoyed this novel. I forgot to mention, if you'd like to check out my chapter-by-chapter reading vlog of this book, I will throw a link up in the corner here. And yes, I will probably continue with this series because it did pique my interest enough. I'm not sure when I'm going to get into it because I've been reading a lot of fantasy lately, but let me know, did you read The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker? Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? I'm willing to bet there will be a bit of both because this does seem like a very divisive novel. But again, this novel definitely feels like fantasy is headed in the right direction. So thank you, Bakker, for taking the time. And if you out there would like to check out my own work, my own novels, you can check out the links in the description below. And thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.